Okay, so we're going to have a look at some of the magic rules in 4th edition. The magic rules didn't change all that much, and if I get time, I'll look at the endless spells, but that might be a future video. So we have this article, and basically it just confirms that things are the same as they used to be, and then also has some additional stuff about prayers, which are quite different. So initially, I'm a bit disheartened by the fact that we're still rolling 2 dice against 2 dice for an unbind. To me, it's not a very interesting magic system, and there's like a mini game of I'm pretending like these early spells are really important to me to try and bait out your unbinds so that you don't have any unbinds left for the really important spell that I have at the end of my casting sequence. And your opponent is playing this similar mini game where they're saying, well, you know, I know you're casting Arcane Bolt and that's not a very valuable spell, but hey, look, I see you rolled a 5, so I have a really good chance of unbinding that. So maybe I want to use one of my unbinds, because maybe if I wait to unbind your last spell and you roll a 12, well, I can't unbind that, so now I've wasted my unbind. So there's a bit of risk reward. There's a little bit of like, once you figure out every spell your opponent is going to cast this phase, and you know all your unbinds and that all your unbinds are in range, there is a tiny mini game in there, but to me it's not very compelling, and it sort of, if anything, leads to this communication problem between players where sometimes people are unwilling to sort of tell you what the important spell is that they're going to cast later in the phase. You have to figure out all of the spells they have access to and which one is going to be the most important for their army. That's going to get a bit worse now because now they have access to an entire spell lore and to a manifestation lore as well. So you're going to have to know a lot about their army to know what to unbind. And to me, that just creates communication problems. It's fine if your opponent's like, this is the spell in my army that is really the good one. This is the one you want to watch out for. But a lot of opponents don't want to do that, which is, you know, fair enough. They don't want to do that. But yeah, I don't like that interaction that you get. There's also a problem where unbinds are sort of favored because you don't have to unbind something that fails to cast. So if you both have 3 wizards or 3 casts, then, and the first spell of the hero phase just fails, then your opponent still has 3 unbinds, but you only have 2 more casts, so they don't have to worry about, I guess, they didn't have to worry about, they could try and unbind everything. But even if they were down a wizard, if it was, they had 2 wizards and you had 3, they still have sort of an advantage with unbinding. So almost always opponents can unbind your stuff, and the result of that means that you don't really worry about the casting value, you're more worried about the unbinding, right? There are situations where your opponent can't unbind your stuff, and we've got magical intervention now you can cast in your opponent's turn. Because you're sharing unbinds and casts, there is a little bit more of an opening to cast while your opponent has no ability to unbind you. I think we also lost heroic willpower, so your opponent, if they don't have any wizards, they have to use the new places of power thing, the like magical terrain, to be able to unbind you. And there's a lot more counterplay to that. You can stop them from standing near that terrain piece, but that's probably a bit difficult to do, stop all of their heroes from being near that terrain piece, especially if the boards are symmetrical like that. But I think they risk taking damage or something if they use that unbind, so maybe there's a bit more opportunity to cast spells without them being unbound or without, you know, them facing an unbinding roll. But at the moment, pretty much you always face an unbinding roll, particularly on the key spell that you want to get done, right? You can cast useless spells all turn and your opponent won't bother to unbind them, but the one that you actually need for your army to function, that'll be the one they try and unbind, and they usually have at least 1 or 2 unbinds in their army. So thinking about it that way, when you look at a spell, say it has a casting value of 6, the average unbind roll is going to be 7 or higher, right? Like if you roll on 2 dice, you're going to get a 7 on average. Not 7 or higher, sorry, just 7 on average. And to beat an unbinding roll of 7, you need a 7 or higher. So the average casting roll for you, if it's being contested by an unbind roll, that's going to be a 7. So pretty much any casting value lower than 7, in your mind, you can just treat it as a 7, right? And I think people get this a little bit backwards because of the sequence of casting roll, then unbinding roll sort of not needing to unbind a spell that doesn't make it to the casting roll. So for example, if you have a casting value 8 spell, let's say we're talking about this Mighty Headbutt, and the casting value is 8, and you roll a 6, and you think to yourself, damn, if this spell had a casting value of 6, I would have got this spell off. But because it has a casting value of 8, it's failed. But not really, because if you rolled a 6, then your opponent is very likely to have unbound that spell anyway. Because your roll is so low, the unbinding roll is probably going to be higher. And you can think about this like, if we had a spell with a casting value of 2, so anything that's not a miscast, it goes off, right? The spell will go off on a 3. But the fact that your casting roll is a 3 means that your opponent's unbinding roll is just going to unbind your spell. Right? So the way to think about spells, in my opinion, especially the important spells, is they're going to face an unbinding roll, and that unbinding roll is going to be an average of 7. So you don't really need to worry about casting value on spells. I ignore it most of the time. Just every time you have a high casting value spell that's like an 8 or a 9, and you roll that 7 or 8, and it fails to cast because the casting value is like 1 higher, just keep in mind that your opponent probably would have unbound that spell anyway. So don't be afraid of high casting values. I'm a bit surprised we're yet to see Games Workshop push the casting value down, and I don't know why that's the case. If you've seen leaks of Mystic Shield, I'm pretty sure Mystic Shield still casts on a 5, but now it gives you a 6-up ward only for the turn that you cast it. So Mystic Shield is basically useless. If you're playing a Death Army or any of the other armies that just get 6-up wards like Fire Slayers or Daughters of Cain, it's definitely useless. And it only lasts for the turn that you cast it instead of until the next battle round. It's a very, very weak spell. They could make that spell cast on a 2-up and it would be totally balanced, right? If your opponent doesn't want you to have that spell, they can unbind it, but I don't even think they'd waste the unbind. If anything, I feel like just for the fact of having a wizard, they should be able to give out that 6-up ward by casting on a 2-up. But we don't see those sorts of spells, even though I feel that's a design space that makes sense. They're the types of spells where it's questionable for your opponent whether they want to try and unbind them. They're very easy for the wizard to cast, but it's questionable whether you want to waste the unbind. Whereas spells that have higher casting values, like 8 or 9, those things make a little bit more sense to me. But this middle ground, casting values of 8 or 9 make sense because they're higher than the average unbinding roll, the average unbinding roll of 7. Whereas having a spell like on a 6, which is where most of the spells are, right? Most of the casting values are sort of 5 or 6. That's the exact area where your opponent's unbinding roll is going to be about that value on average anyway. So I find the whole magic system, the whole 2d6 against 2d6 system to be really boring. And I think Games Workshop thinks about it incorrectly. They're trying to think about it like hit versus wound. It's like a sequence, and you pass the casting value on your initial roll, and then maybe you pass the unbinding value. But because it's relying on the same one roll, it's not like you roll to hit and then roll to wound. It's like you roll to hit and wound in the one roll. And you have to beat both the casting value and the unbinding value. And so most of the time, it's just going to be the unbinding value. I don't know if I'm making complete sense there. Hopefully that explains a bit why I find the system boring. We don't need to worry too much about casting. It's really all about unbinding. That said, we should look at the unbind rule. It is the same. And I'm a bit sad that it's the same because 30 inches is an awkward distance. It means that you're pretty much always in unbinding range, but not necessarily right at the start of the game. And at the moment, in 3rd edition, that creates an interesting opportunity because your opponent is going to, when they outdrop you, they're going to have their entire army down on the board, so you know where all their wizards are, all their unbinds are, and they're probably going to choose to go second in the battle round, so they have more control over the double turn. And because of that, you're going to go first, and you can put your wizard outside of 30 inches of all of their heroes. so they can't unbind you on turn 1. And this is a really big deal because Mystic Shield is really powerful at the moment. So you can cast Mystic Shield on a unit very reliably. It's only got a 5-up casting value, and obviously the casting value is relevant when your opponent isn't unbinding you, but most of the time they are unbinding you because of this 30-inch range thing. If this went down, if this was like an 18-inch range, then casting values would come back to mattering and 6s and 5s would be a lot more important. But because you pretty much always get unbound, that's why casting values aren't that important. But yeah, at the start of the game, you can set your guy outside of 30, cast Mystic Shield on turn 1, and that sets you up in a defensive posture to withstand the double turn that your opponent might get on turn 2. I think the turn 3 double turn is usually more crippling, but still there's this tiny interaction with the turn order and with Mystic Shield that makes this 30-inch range make sense to me. But with the penalty for choosing a double turn, that you don't get a battle tactic on the turn that you choose to take a double turn, I think a lot more players will choose to go first in the battle round on turn 1. So that this 30-inch unbinding range really gives an advantage to the person going first on turn 1, because you'll set up outside of 30, cast your spells, and then you move into 30. So when it's your opponent's turn, you can unbind their stuff, but they weren't able to unbind your stuff. There is a little bit of nuance with if you set up outside of 30 with all of your wizards from all of their wizards, then they'll be able to use the magical intervention and you won't have an unbind. But if you're setting up second, like they're in a 1-drop and they've put their entire army down, you can put one of your heroes or one of your wizards with an unbind in range of their wizards and one of them out of range. So you've got a spell that they can't unbind and you've got an unbind for their magical intervention. So that it still works, but that's really the only situation where the 30-inch unbind makes sense to me. It's just at that deployment phase, just at the start of the game. And it's an awkward distance to measure because usually you're just sort of throwing your tape measure into the middle of your opponent's army, trying not to damage their paint job. Like it is just too long of a distance to measure conveniently. Most of the time you don't have to measure it. And I wish they'd sort of gone either direction. If they just said, well, unbinding is board wide, you don't have to measure it. Just if you've got a wizard, you can unbind and it's just counting the number of wizards. Or if they'd made it shorter range, like 18 inches or something, so that it was more of a conscious decision to put your wizard in unbind range. I think both of those options I would have liked more than keeping it at 30. 30 is just an awkward sort of almost always in range, but you have to check anyway kind of distance. And there's one more thing. You know how I was saying there's that awkward interaction with your opponent trying to they're trying to play coy about which spell it is that you're supposed to unbind, but they know and you know they know, but you're both sort of like acting like you don't know which spell it is. You want to unbind the Mind Razor, but just you're both pretending that this Arcane Bolt is really important. That is exacerbated by this unbind thing, because there's a correct order of unbinds. Like if you have wizards that are near terrain that gives you +1 to unbind, or which I'm not sure you'll still have in the new edition, but if you've got some wizards that have a bonus to unbind and some that don't, you have to like figure out who's in range of who. And sometimes it's not always the case that like maybe they have 3 wizards and you have 3 wizards, so you have an unbind for every one of their spells, but you have to make sure you use the right wizard to unbind their wizard. And a lot of the time, because it's so permissive, because it's 30-inch, you just sort of make an unbinding roll and then figure out who it is later. But there should be some sort of gamesmanship in it. There should be like, I'm going to unbind with this guy because that's the spell you're casting. But that also requires your opponent to be clear about which guy they're casting the spell with. And I find all these like little nuances add up to just an unpleasant casting phase. They make it take a little bit longer when you just have to double check and say, oh, it's that guy casting this spell, not that guy, even though they can both cast it now. It's going to be more important, well, not more important, it's the same importance. it's important to know which of your wizards is unbinding and which of their wizards is casting, and in what order, and how many casts they have left, and which spells they can cast. And yeah, with the addition of having access to more spells in the lore, all of this stuff is a lot of mental load for something that is a very, very, very marginal benefit. Even once you figure out all of the casting order and all of exactly who you need to unbind with and what they need to what needs to be unbound and all that sort of thing, it makes pretty much no difference to the outcome. It's a very, very slim benefit to having this all figured out. But there is a benefit, so you do have to figure it all out. And in my mind, those sorts of things where there's a marginal benefit, that's what bloat is. That's where you can make cuts to the game to streamline it, make it much more faster. And something like just removing this 30-inch range so that you just have to count the number of wizards and the number of wizards they have, it just removes one little aspect of having to figure out that little semi-puzzle in the hero phase. I'm probably overemphasizing this because we've had this magic system, this 2d6 against 2d6 system for a while, and I haven't liked it for the whole time that we've had it. But like, it works. It's okay. It's a little bit random for me, but you know, I do like the idea of magic in a fantasy setting. So, and it hasn't ruined it. I do like that they've just got a nice power level thing. We kind of had that before, but that's a neat little addition. Makes it a little bit clearer. There's one more thing I think at the bottom of the article before I talk about priests. This Banish Manifestation thing, just combining the endless spells and the endless, or the invocations or whatever they are, into one thing is just common sense. I think they're already a little subsystem on the side that has its own special rules, and it's a bit confusing for players. So combining them a little bit means that there are less auxiliary rules that you have to remember. It makes it easier for someone to understand when somebody pulls one out and says, I'm using this thing this game. And they're at the point, especially when you look at the article for them, they're at the point where they're actually much more straightforward. And they don't have this out of phase movement stuff. They just move around like units and they charge like units. And there's only a few differences. And those differences, I think, mostly make sense. So manifestations should be much easier to keep track of. So I like this change. All right. The priest thing, I think this is a really good change as well. The big change is now you keep your ritual points, right? I think that's the way to think about this. So you've got your prayer roll, you roll the prayer, and if you roll enough, you can answer the prayer if you want to. You can keep the points and try and go for a higher effect, because all of the prayers have this bonus effect if you get a really high roll. And if you fail the prayer roll, like if you roll below the answer value, then you get to keep your points. And when I think about it that way, as like a consolation prize, like when I fail my roll, I still do something for the turn. I think that's a really neat way to give heroes this always does something kind of effect. It's a bit like when you had once per game artifacts and you have like, well, on a 2-up, it does D3 mortals or something like that. And you changed that ability from on a 2-up, it does D3 mortals to on a 1, it does 1 mortal wound. And then on a 2-up, it does D3 mortals or something like that. Just so it always does something. I think abilities feel nice when they always do something. And they have this little consolation prize. Like the something that they're always doing is just improving next turn's roll. And for me, I think that's really neat for priests. And there's a lot of designs. If we look at this Witchbane Curse seems to have that design philosophy in mind. The main effect that you want is to subtract 1 from the target's power level. I don't think you want to be saving up over multiple turns intentionally, right? If you roll a 5 on your Witchbane Curse and you're within 18 of an enemy wizard, I don't think you want to give up a turn of reducing their power level so that you can get to this 3 mortal damage. I think just the 3 mortal damage is going to be a bonus that you get when you roll really high on the next roll. So this sort of design philosophy is just when you fail, you do get some little bonus thing. There is another design philosophy, and I think there's a prayer we've seen that works like this, where you can design the prayer so that the normal effect, the unempowered effect, is basically nothing, and then the empowered effect is the actual effect of the prayer. So you would just have, I don't know, effects do nothing, but on a 12 plus, do something really important. And that means that the priest has to spend turn after turn charging up, and then they get a really powerful effect on on a later turn. These things are really hard to balance because it's hard to conceptualize a unit doing something for 3 turns, or doing nothing for 2 turns, and then doing 3 turns worth of things on 1 turn. It always feels like it's too much to do those 3 turns worth of things in that 1 turn. But there's like an interesting design space. You can have a wizard that would have a spell that's like, or a prayer, sorry, you can have a priest that would have a prayer that would maybe you deal D3 mortals to each unit within a distance equal to the chanting roll. And you can charge that up as much as you want. You could charge the chanting roll up to 18 and then do D3 mortals to every unit within 18, but it'll be hard to charge up to 18, right? You can use magical intervention, I think, to pray in your opponent's turn. So you can charge twice as quick by praying in your turn and praying in their turn. But there's a risk element to it because that wizard might die. There's another risk element to it, which is that if you roll a 1, you lose ritual points. So innately charging up points intentionally is very risky. I'm not sure that needed to be there, that you lose points, because it really weakens that design space. Like having this open to be able to charge a wizard up like a bomb and to sit this guy on the point all game doing a ritual, that's pretty thematic to me, to have him performing this long, complicated ritual that has a big payoff. You could have something that's like, this guy has 20 plus on a ritual, but if you get the 20, it gives your entire army +1 attack or something. It is something that you have to charge up and that you get 1 use of, and your opponent, it's like a little mini objective for your opponent to take this guy out before it goes off. There's lots and lots of interesting things they could do in this space, and having this on a roll of a 1, you lose D3 ritual points, really undermines that possibility. Mostly, I think the thing they're going for is just the consolation prize design space, where if you fail to make your casting roll, if you roll less than the 4 when you're casting your Witchbane Curse, then you still get something out of it. You still get some prayer points. You've got a more reliable Witchbane Curse next turn. This thing also means the fact that 1s always fail still means that you can't guarantee things. Initially, when I was looking at this, I thought it'd be neat to say like Translocate is a really important prayer. It teleports your Stormcast units. I don't know if we still have Translocate, but people will take a Lord Relictor with Translocate and he gets that prayer off on a 2-up, and they'll give him High Priest so he can re-roll that, so that you guarantee that you're getting to teleport the unit when you need to teleport it. It's really important for some strategies just to make sure you can use that teleport. So like if you need a battle tactic and you want to make sure that you score it, you need to know that it's going to work. And I thought initially, it'd be really cool if you can spend a couple turns praying, or just one phase praying, so that the next phase you're guaranteed to get your Translocate, or it makes it very, very, very easy to get. But it doesn't exactly work like that, because you still have this 1 on a roll of a 1, you still fail. You can sort of make it easy. Like if Translocate goes off on a 3-up, then you spend a turn praying, then it'll go to a 2-up in the following turn pretty much. But you still have that risk of 1, and you still have this weird losing ritual points. I'm not sure I like that. But overall, I like the change to priests because of the design space that it opens up. And I wish they'd done something like this with Magic. But we didn't see that. I think it'll still be fun. The big changes to the, I guess I should talk about this. The spell laws allow you to know multiple spells. I'll look at, there is an article about the spell laws. It might be in the Endless Spells one, but I'll have a look at that before we head off. So we were in Wizards and Priests. I don't think it'll be in the spells, but we might. Yeah, we'll leave that for the future. But where's it's not in Stormcast, is it? Oh, I need to see the Stormcast Eternals lore. And we see the whole lore. Maybe I've seen it in a leak somewhere. Skaven Hide lore. Anyway, I do know that the Stormcast Eternal spell lore has 3 spells in it. They all have 3 spells. And one of them is unlimited, and it's really nice having unlimited. If they're wise about which spells they give that keyword to, unlimited is a really, really valuable addition to the game, because having lots of wizards and not having anything to do with them is a bit like I was saying. One of the things I like about the priest thing is that when you fail to pray, you get something. One of the big problems with wizards is often you don't have anything to do with them. And at the moment, you can like cast Mystic Shield or do Arcane Bolt. But if we've seen Mystic Shield and Mystic Shield is really bad, you might be out of range for Arcane Bolt. So having something that you can do as an unlimited spell is really nice. And the Stormcast Eternals unlimited spell is like deal D3 mortal wounds to the closest enemy unit that hasn't been damaged by this spell. So every one of your wizards can cast this and just deal D3 mortal wounds to something, right? It's unlimited range. It just works. It's a really, really neat unlimited spell. Their other 2 spells are like, I think they have an 18-inch range, or it might be 24. They've got a fairly long range thing that reduces the number of dice a unit uses for their charge roll by 1. So if you're 18 or 24, whatever it is, away from the enemy, you want to use that to stop them getting into combat, to stop their ability to charge you. And then there's another spell that's like a 12-inch. It's quite a close range spell. I think just gives them -1 to wound on their attack rolls. So for a Stormcast Eternals player, it's pretty much just whichever spell you are in range for, that's the spell you want to use, right? If they're in combat with you, give them -1 to wound. If they're not yet in combat with you, reduce the number of dice that they're using to charge you by 1. And if they're further than that, if they're out of range of the other stuff, then you can use your unlimited range spell to just deal D3 mortals to something. Your wizard always has something to do, which in the current rules is not the case. In the current rules, you have to pick a single spell from the spell lore, and then 90% of the time, that wizard is not in range to do that thing. And it's just sort of dull. Feels like wizards spend a lot of time casting Mystic Shield, and we know, because of other leaks, we know Mystic Shield is going to be very weak. So relying on your lore spell, your unlimited spell to have something to do, that's really neat. I suppose the other thing that your wizard will have to do is the endless spells and invocations. Well, your priest will do invocations, but yeah, you'll have endless spells available to you as well. I do think endless spells are weaker than they have ever been. I know they're free now, but they're free because they're very weak. But I think I'll leave it there for this video. I'll do endless spells in the next one. And actually, no, fuck it. I'll do endless spells right now. I've got time. This is going well. We'll have a look at endless spells, because it might not be enough for a whole video. Okay, so endless spells are weaker now than they were in the previous edition. They got some bonuses. The biggest bonuses are obviously they're free, so you don't have to pay points for them. That's a big upside. You still have to have a wizard in your army and still have to cast it, so there is a cost to them. There's an opportunity cost, and you're still paying points for that wizard, so you do need to get some value out of them. But the other thing that they got is that the banishment roll is different to the casting value. this was a big issue with the current endless spells, is that anything that was easy to cast was also easy to unbind. And because of that thing I mentioned earlier, when I was talking about casting rolls, where the casting roll is actually, you should just think about it as like your opponent's unbinding roll is actually the casting roll. It meant that any endless spell that had a low casting roll was actually worse because it was just easier to unbind. But anything with a really high casting roll just meant it was hard to unbind. And so things like the Purple Sun saw some kind of usage partially because they had high casting rolls. So when you roll like a 9, it's hard for your opponent to unbind it, you get it off, and then because it's got a high casting value, they can't dispel it in future turns very easily. Whereas if you've got something like it has a casting value of 5, well, you roll a 9 to cast it, your opponent can't unbind it, that's good, you at least get to put it down for a turn, but then your opponent just dispels it because it's got a 5 up. So they've changed that, they've unhooked those two values. I think that's one of the biggest buffs to endless spells. But at the same time, they've added in a bunch of other ways for you to get rid of endless spells. And I think that's the way to think about being able to attack them, right? They have health and armor save and all that sort of stuff. All that means is now that now they're vulnerable to a lot more ways of being dispelled. So they're much, much weaker than they used to be. So we can have a look. They still move the same sort of distance, but before, so Quicksilver Swords is a good example. Before, you used to set this up 8 away from you, and then it would move 8. But my understanding is they don't move in the turn they're set up. So I guess we'll have a look at these things because that explains all of that. So all manifestations, models can move through them, but cannot end a move on them. That's sensible. Units can finish a charge move within half an inch of them, so you can charge at endless spells, which is really important because if they don't do anything, if you have a predatory endless spell like Quicksilver Swords, and it's not a threat, like it does low damage or it's very, very easy to kill, then you'll often just be giving your opponent free movement by being able to charge them. This is another weakness of endless spells. You didn't used to get free movement from being able to charge endless spells, but now you can charge endless spells. I'm also not sure, we'll keep reading, but I don't think you can as being in combat if you're standing next to them. But maybe you are, maybe you have to be. We'll see. So they can be picked as the target of enemy abilities like shoot or fight. So your opponent can, if you charge an endless spell into someone, they can pile in and fight it. They can be damaged or destroyed, but don't count as destroyed units for battle tactics or abilities. That's fine. They can use core abilities or abilities on their war scroll, but they can't use commands, and they can't be affected by friendly abilities unless they specifically affect manifestations. There might be some weird stuff that comes out of this, but overall, I like that they're a bit segmented and you can't buff them up. That'll create some weird situations because they're like allies. They're universal things that can go into any army. And if you could get an ability that I'm going to give this spell like crit 2 hits, it might make it weirdly good in that one army or something like that. I don't know. There'd be some weird interactions, and putting this in just makes it a bit easier for them to balance the endless spells, I think. And cannot contest or control objectives. That's fine. They don't need any objective control. Moving manifestations, so the predatory ones, you'll typically need to set up 9 away from them, and you will need to retreat to move out of combat. So when it says them here, I think it means 9 away from the enemy. And you'll need to retreat to move out of combat. So these things get locked in combat. When it says you will need to retreat, I don't know if it means the enemy will need to retreat to get out of combat with them, or whether you will need to retreat with the spell to get out of combat with it. In any case, I don't think... most spells, like 6 health on a 5-up save, most spells aren't going to last more than 1 round of combat. So, depending on what this means, if you have to retreat to get out of combat with an endless spell, then maybe they're a bit more useful. But if this is saying that just the endless spell needs to retreat to leave combat, that's expected, I think. Moving manifestations typically cannot be set up within 9 inches of enemy units when summoned, and can't move in the movement phase after being set up. This is a big deal, right? At the moment, endless spells that are good, in my opinion, the predatory ones, are ones that have a really long range. Because of this problem with dispelling, the ideal is to summon an endless spell and then move it and deal damage with it in the turn that you cast it. So like Ravenex Gnashing Jaws is pretty good. I think it sets up within 8. It's got 3d6 movement with a reroll on the turn that you summon it. So it moves about 20 inches in the turn that you summon it and then does a bunch of damage. And then your opponent can dispel it because that happens all the time, right? They get a chance to unbind it and they get a chance to dispel it. So you need to be able to do damage with it on the turn when you summon it. But this means that because you have to charge with the endless spell to get in combat and you have to set up 9 away, very likely you can't deal damage with the endless spell on the turn that you summon it. So very different. It's just, in my mind, another nerf, another way that endless spells are not very good. So they're easier to kill. They're harder to get into combat. When you get them into combat, your opponent will probably just kill them with attacks. So even when you summon your Quicksilver Swords, you move it across the table, your opponent might just banish it, which admittedly is harder now. So that's an advantage for endless spells. But even when it gets there, it'll get 1 round of attacks, which you have to use a fight activation for. Right? If you're trying to fight with multiple units, then you have to use one of your fight activations on Quicksilver Swords. You're not going to want to do that. Your opponent gets free movement by being able to pile around Quicksilver Swords, and then they can kill it. And they can also charge it and get a lot of free movement out of that. So in my mind, there are going to be a lot of situations where using an endless spell is going to be a bigger detriment than just not using it. Right? They have to do something. They have to put out enough damage. They have to be worth activating in combat. That they'll be worthwhile. I think the other thing is, I guess shooting units can't shoot if they're in combat now, and shooting units also have to target the closest unit with covering fire. So there's a little bit of a space to use endless spells to soak things like covering fire or to try and charge into shooting units where a shooting unit genuinely might not have the damage profile to take this out. Or maybe we see endless spells that the whole point of the endless spell is that it's got a fairly durable profile and doesn't really do any damage. So it actually just, it's like a mobile or a screen that you can summon, and it works like that. And there's a bit of design space for that sort of stuff. I don't imagine Games Workshop is going to use it, but I can imagine endless spells that would be good despite the limitations of setting up 9 away and needing to charge and giving your opponent all these movement buffs. I do think there are some... I might just... I'm going to have a quick look at some of this. Yeah, it matters a lot if endless spells are treated like enemy units for things like being in combat, right? If you're stuck in combat and you need to retreat to get away from them, if that's what this means, and maybe what this is saying is like they count as an enemy unit. So when you're doing setups, you need to set up 9 away from the endless spell. It counts as an enemy unit for that. And when you're in combat with the endless spell, you'll have to retreat out of combat to get away from it. If that's the case, these things are marginally more useful. But I find if you're getting into combat with the endless spell, it's probably going to die in that turn. So they need to be durable enough to survive a round of damage for them to make sense. Or they need to do enough in a single round of damage for the casting of them to make sense. We'll still probably see them because, as I said earlier, Mystic Shield is bad and your wizards want something to do. And we've seen some of the unlimited spells, like the Slanesh unlimited spell is very weak. And there was another unlimited spell that Vile Transference, the Soulblight Gravelords one that we've just seen, doesn't work that well. It's got like an 18-inch range and you can't target the same unit with it more than once, and it's only useful on really big hordes of units. So you probably won't cast that multiple times in a turn. And that means that those wizards in an army like Soulblight, they have a lot of wizards in their army. Probably means that they're going to have a lot of time with not that many spells. Then they have another 2 spells in the lore, presumably. So you will end up seeing endless spells, mostly because wizards don't have anything else to do. But I do think they're very, very weak compared to what they used to be. It's just that you used to pay points for them. And they weren't even good before. Like, they've been nerfed and they were bad before. So I don't expect people to want to use these. It's just because they're literally free, and sometimes you'll have a wizard that isn't doing anything. So you'll include them in your list. You have a free manifestation lore. You may as well put it in there. And I'm sure that there are static endless spells that do buffs that are actually quite good. So just a quick look at the static manifestations. You can ignore them when setting up units, and you can end and move within 3 inches of them, and you can freely move away from them. Oh, okay. So this is... should have read more. So this does refer to the enemy units need to set up 9 away from the endless spells, and enemy units will need to retreat to get out of combat with them. So that makes them marginally more useful. If they survive combat, you can use them to tie up combats and things like that. But for static manifestations, you can ignore that. You cannot use any abilities that involve moving. That makes sense. And they typically have more freedom to place when they're summoned. So you don't have to be set up 9 away from enemy units. All right, that sort of stuff makes sense. The reason I think static ones will get used is because they won't give you your opponent the same... I say they won't give them the same opportunity for charging. You still can charge the static manifestations. Your opponents still do get additional movement from that. But often, I assume, you'll be setting up a static manifestation like Cogs, for example. You'll have your wizard, and then you'll set up the manifestation right next to it, and they could kind of just charge the wizard anyway, so they don't get a lot of advantage from the existence of that manifestation. And then it'll give you buffs, right? Because I don't imagine when you look at any of these endless spell war scrolls, they'll survive a round of combat, or they'll be worth activating over any other unit. So most of the time, these things are just going to crash into the enemy and then die. But the static ones, if they have a good effect, something like Cogs, for some reason, is good every edition. If it's free and all you need to do is cast it and it has a good effect, then pretty much everyone is going to take it in their list, and then they'll end up casting it. So I assume something like that will happen at some point. One of the endless spells, probably one of the static ones that gives you a buff. One of them will be good, and that's the one pretty much everyone will take. It will see play because people have wizards for other reasons, and the wizards will want something to do, and often their spell lore will mean that they don't always have something to do, so they'll end up casting these spells. That's my prediction. I think some people, if you listen to Vince, they talk about, or there's going to be endless spells everywhere. It's a season of endless spells. They're going to show up all over the place. I'm not sure that's true. There are a lot of downsides, and you can still banish them. You can get rid of them by shooting them and by charging them, or by using abilities on them like charge impact and attacking them, which you couldn't do in previous editions, and they were bad in previous editions. I know you had to pay points for them, but there weren't a lot of points, and people still didn't do it. People didn't want to pay 30 points or 20 points for endless spells. They just weren't worth taking at all, and even when they were, they made a really marginal difference. So I'm not expecting them to take over the game, but I'm kind of excited to see them. I wish they were a little bit more flavorful and a bit more interesting. A lot of the time, they all end up looking a bit like a different version of Quicksilver swords or whatever. They just like move a bit and do like D3 mortals. Hopefully we get some more interesting, different endless spells. A bit like the Sanctum. We saw that in Lumineth, the Sanctum of Amontek or something. That one's not too bad. It's a bit of an interesting take, and it does something a bit different. So if we see some good ones, I'll be happy. But all around, not super chuffed with the changes to Magic or the lack of changes to Magic. I think this is an interesting direction to go with endless spells. I'm not a big fan of endless spells, but I don't hate them either. It'll be interesting to see if they make play. And yeah, I will leave it there for this one because I am getting a bit on. I think it's about 45 minutes for this video. As I say, in the future videos, we'll have a look at what's left? We'll have a look at terrain, and then I think we might be getting on to army stuff. And I'll probably do battle tactics actually. Yeah, so we'll do terrain and then battle tactics, and then once the indexes start coming out, we'll do indexes as well. Okie doke. Have a good one.